Did you know that the Deep South harbors some of the most chilling, unsolved mysteries in the country? From eerie encounters on lonely backroads to terrifying experiences in abandoned places, the region is steeped in tales that make your skin crawl. Tonight, I'm going to share with you some real-life stories that happened right here. Stories that will make you think twice the next time you find yourself alone after dark. Story 1. The Man in the Woods. I grew up in a small town in Alabama, nestled deep in the woods where the trees were thick and the roads were narrow. When I was about 16, I used to help my uncle on his farm, which was about 5 miles out from our house. He always needed an extra hand, especially during harvest season, and I didn't mind the work. It kept me busy and out of trouble. One late summer evening, I decided to take a shortcut home. There was this old dirt path that cut through the woods, and it would save me nearly 20 minutes of walking. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the trees, but I wasn't worried. I'd taken this path countless times during the day, though never at night. As I walked, the sounds of crickets and cicadas filled the air, but I couldn't shake this nagging feeling that something was off. I kept hearing what sounded like twigs snapping behind me, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there. I brushed it off as animals moving about, though the hairs on the back of my neck were standing straight up. About halfway through the woods, I caught a whiff of something rotten, like a dead animal. It was overpowering, and I instinctively covered my nose with my shirt. That's when I saw it, a figure, barely visible in the dim light, standing just off the path. He was tall, lanky, and his clothes were ragged like he'd been living out there for God knows how long. My heart started racing. I stopped dead in my tracks, trying to convince myself that it was just some homeless guy who had taken shelter in the woods. But there was something wrong about the way he stood there, so still, so silent, like he was waiting for something. "Hey, you all right?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. He didn't respond, didn't even move. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I could feel my palms sweating, the urge to turn and run fighting with the need to keep my eyes on him. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly backed away, not daring to take my eyes off him. But as I did, he started to move, no, not move, more like lurch, towards me. His steps were uneven, like his legs didn't quite work right, and the smell got stronger, more pungent. Panic took over. I turned and ran as fast as I could, not caring about the branches that scratched my face or the roots that threatened to trip me. I could hear his heavy, dragging footsteps behind me, closer and closer. I didn't dare look back. When I finally burst out of the woods and onto the road, I didn't stop running until I reached home, breathless and terrified. I never took that shortcut again, and I never told anyone about the man in the woods, because deep down, I wasn't sure he was entirely human. Story 2. The Highway Rest Stop. A few years ago, I was driving back to Mississippi from a work trip in Texas. It was a long drive, and by the time I crossed into Louisiana, I was exhausted. The highways out there can get pretty desolate at night. Miles of nothing but trees and the occasional gas station. I remember it was around 2 a.m. when I decided to pull over at a rest stop to catch a quick nap. It was one of those small, outdated rest areas, the kind with a few vending machines, some picnic tables, and a dingy restroom. The lot was empty except for a single, beat-up truck parked at the far end. I parked my car, reclined my seat, and closed my eyes, hoping to get some rest before the final leg of the trip. But just as I started to drift off, I heard the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel. They were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. My eyes shot open, and I glanced around, but I didn't see anyone. I figured it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me, so I shut my eyes again. But then the footsteps came back, this time circling around my car. I sat up, peering into the darkness, but there was no one there. The lot was still empty, except for that old truck. My heart was pounding, and I had this sudden, overwhelming feeling that I wasn't alone. Just then, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A man, tall, with a baseball cap pulled low over his face, was standing near the restroom, watching me. He was too far away for me to see his features clearly, but something about him just felt wrong. I locked my doors and grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. I cursed under my breath, feeling trapped and vulnerable. The man started walking towards my car, slow and steady, like he had all the time in the world. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there. I started the car and threw it into reverse, my hands shaking. As I backed out, the man broke into a run, heading straight for me. I floored it, my tires squealing on the pavement as I sped out of the rest stop and back onto the highway. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, my heart still racing. I pulled into a well-lit gas station and sat there for a while, trying to calm down. I kept thinking about that man, wondering what he would have done if I hadn't left when I did. But the scariest part? As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw that old truck following me. Story 3. The Forgotten Barn. When I was a kid, my grandparents owned a piece of land out in rural Georgia, surrounded by thick woods and old, forgotten trails. My cousins and I used to spend our summers exploring every inch of that place, daring each other to venture deeper into the trees or climb the tallest hills. One summer, we stumbled across something we'd never seen before. An old, weathered barn, hidden away in a dense thicket. The wood was rotting, the roof caving in, and the whole place seemed like it had been abandoned for decades. It gave us the creeps, but naturally, we decided to check it out. The inside was dark and smelled of mold and decay. There were old tools scattered around, rusted and covered in dust, and piles of hay that had long since turned to mush. But the thing that really caught our attention was the trapdoor in the corner, partially hidden under a pile of old sacks. "Bet you won't open it," my cousin Josh dared me, grinning like an idiot. Not one to back down, I shoved the sacks aside and pulled on the heavy, iron ring. The door creaked open, revealing a set of narrow, stone steps leading down into the darkness. We were all spooked, but our curiosity got the better of us. We grabbed a couple of rusty lanterns that were lying around, somehow still with oil in them, and lit them up. The stairs were steep and the air grew colder the deeper we went. The lantern light barely penetrated the darkness, but we pressed on. At the bottom of the stairs, we found ourselves in a small, cramped cellar. The walls were lined with shelves, all filled with dusty jars of preserved food. But what really drew our attention was the large, wooden crate in the center of the room, covered in cobwebs. My heart was pounding as I walked over to it. The lid was partially pried open, like someone had started to open it but stopped. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to leave it alone, but Josh nudged me forward. I pushed the lid the rest of the way off, and the smell hit us immediately. Rotting meat and something else, something metallic. The lantern light flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Inside the crate was a bundle of old, blood-stained clothes, and something else I'll never forget. It was a human jawbone, still attached to a piece of dried, leathery skin. My blood ran cold as I stared at it, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. Josh let out a choked scream, and we all bolted up the stairs, not stopping until we were out of the barn and back in the sunlight. We never went back to that barn. I never told my grandparents what we found, but I've always wondered who or what was in that crate and why it was buried so deep in those woods. Some things are better left forgotten. Story 4. The Hitchhiker. This happened to me a few years ago, driving late at night along a stretch of highway between Mobile and Montgomery, Alabama. It's one of those roads that feels like it goes on forever, with nothing but trees on either side and the occasional abandoned gas station. It was about 1 a.m., and I was exhausted, just trying to keep my eyes on the road. That's when I saw her, a woman standing on the side of the highway, her thumb out, hoping for a ride. She was wearing a simple dress, her hair long and tangled, and she looked to be in her mid-30s. Now, I've always been wary of picking up hitchhikers, especially at night, but something about her seemed desperate, like she was in real trouble. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. She got in without a word, just nodded her thanks and settled into the passenger seat. I noticed she was shivering, even though it was a warm night, so I offered her my jacket, which she accepted with a small, grateful smile. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound being the hum of the engine and the tires on the asphalt. After a few minutes, I tried to make some small talk, asking where she was headed, but she just shook her head, her eyes distant. Something about her was unsettling. She kept glancing in the rearview mirror, like she was expecting someone, or something, to be following us. Her hands were trembling, and she kept fiddling with the hem of her dress. After a few more miles, she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You need to take the next exit," she said. "I can't go any further." I glanced over at her, confused. The exit she was talking about led to a dead-end road that didn't go anywhere, just into the woods. I started to ask why, but the look in her eyes stopped me. They were filled with such fear, such raw terror, that I didn't argue. I took the exit and followed the road until it ended in a small clearing. She got out, still clutching my jacket, and turned to me. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "But you need to leave now. Don't look back. Just go." Before I could ask her what was going on, she turned and disappeared into the trees. I sat there for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Then I remembered the fear in her eyes and decided to do as she said. I turned the car around and headed back to the highway, my heart pounding. I didn't look back, but as I merged onto the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. And there, standing at the edge of the trees, was a figure, tall, broad-shouldered, and shrouded in darkness, watching me drive away. Story 5. The River Crossing. There's a river that runs near my hometown in Louisiana, deep in the bayou. The locals call it the Devil's Crossing because of the number of accidents that have happened there over the years. Cars skidding off the road, people drowning in the dark, murky waters. I had a close call myself when I was 19. I was driving home from a friend's house late at night, and I had to cross the old iron bridge that spanned the river. The bridge was narrow and rusted, barely wide enough for two cars to pass each other. It always gave me the creeps, especially at night. It was raining that night, the kind of heavy, relentless rain that makes it hard to see more than a few feet in front of you. As I approached the bridge, I slowed down, gripping the steering wheel tightly, trying to keep the car from sliding on the wet road. Just as I was about to cross, I saw headlights coming towards me from the other side. They were bright, almost blinding in the rain, and they didn't seem to be slowing down. My heart skipped a beat as I realized the car was coming straight at me, taking up both lanes of the narrow bridge. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop just in time. The other car screeched to a halt as well, mere inches from my bumper. I could barely see the driver through the rain-splattered windshield, but I could tell something was wrong. He was just sitting there, staring at me, his face pale and expressionless. I honked my horn, trying to get him to back up so I could cross, but he didn't move, just kept staring. The rain was pounding on the roof of my car, and the bridge creaked ominously under the weight of both vehicles. Suddenly, the other car's headlights went out. For a moment, I was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from my own headlights. Then, out of nowhere, the driver's door of the other car flew open, and the man stumbled out. He looked terrified, his eyes wide and panicked, and he started running towards me, slipping and sliding on the wet bridge. I couldn't tell what he was saying, but he was waving his arms frantically, like he was trying to warn me about something. And then I saw it, a massive truck, barreling down the road behind him, its horn blaring. The man tried to get out of the way, but he slipped on the wet pavement and fell right into the path of the truck. There was a sickening thud as the truck hit him, sending his body flying over the edge of the bridge and into the river below. The truck driver slammed on his brakes, but it was too late. The man was gone. I sat there in shock, my heart racing, unable to move. The truck driver got out, staring in horror at the spot where the man had disappeared. We both knew there was nothing we could do. The river was dark and deep, and the current would have carried him away in seconds. I finally managed to pull myself together and drove across the bridge, my hands shaking the entire time. I never found out who that man was or why he was so desperate to stop me from crossing the bridge. But I'll never forget the look on his face, the sheer, unbridled terror. And every time I drive past the river now, I can't help but wonder if the Devil's Crossing claimed yet another soul that night. Story 6. The Abandoned Plantation. I used to work as a surveyor in rural Mississippi, which often meant trekking through old, forgotten properties to map out the land. One summer, I was assigned to a piece of land that included a long-abandoned plantation. The main house was a crumbling, decayed structure, with ivy creeping up its once grand walls and broken windows that stared out like hollow eyes. I arrived early in the morning, and even in daylight, the place had an unsettling air about it. The silence was thick, the kind that presses down on you, making every small sound seem amplified. As I walked through the overgrown grounds, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My job was to map the entire area, including the house itself, so I steeled myself and entered through the front door, which hung crookedly on its hinges. Inside, the house was a time capsule. Dust covered everything: the furniture, the ornate wallpaper, even the old family portraits hanging on the walls. The air was musty, filled with the scent of mold and rot. As I made my way through the rooms, I noticed something strange. In the parlor, the dust on the floor was disturbed, like someone had walked through recently. But that was impossible. The house had been abandoned for decades, and I hadn't seen any other signs of recent visitors. I continued my work, trying to ignore the growing unease that gnawed at my stomach. As I climbed the stairs to the second floor, each step creaked loudly, echoing through the empty halls. When I reached the top, I noticed one door at the end of the hall that was slightly ajar. I approached it cautiously, pushing the door open with a creak. The room was a bedroom, once elegant but now decayed like the rest of the house. But what caught my attention was the bed, a large, four-poster bed with tattered, moth-eaten drapes. The sheets were pulled back, and there, lying in the center of the bed, was a single, fresh rose. My heart skipped a beat. There was no way that rose had been there for long. Its petals were vibrant, its scent still strong in the musty air. I looked around, trying to find some explanation, but the room was empty, the silence deafening. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I backed out of the room and hurried down the stairs, my mind racing. Who had placed that rose? And why? The thought of someone else being in the house, watching me, sent my anxiety into overdrive. I left the house as quickly as I could, not bothering to finish my survey. As I stepped outside, the oppressive silence lifted slightly, but the feeling of being watched didn't. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a split second, I thought I saw movement in one of the upstairs windows, a shadowy figure standing where the rose had been. But when I blinked, it was gone. I never went back to that plantation, and I didn't include the rose in my report. Some things, I decided, were better left unexplored. Story 7. The Stalker at the Gas Station. Back when I was in college in Baton Rouge, I worked a late shift at a 24-hour gas station just off the interstate. It wasn't the safest part of town, but I needed the money, so I put up with the drunks and occasional troublemakers that wandered in during the early hours of the morning. One night, around 3 a.m., the place was dead quiet. I was behind the counter, half dozing, when I heard the bell over the door jingle. I looked up to see a man walk in, tall, with a dirty baseball cap pulled low over his face. He was scruffy, with an unkempt beard, and his clothes were filthy, like he'd been sleeping rough for a while. He didn't go to the shelves or the cooler. Instead, he just stood in the middle of the store, staring at me. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something about him was off. His eyes were vacant, but there was an intensity to his gaze that made me uneasy. "Can I help you with something?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't respond, just kept staring. After what felt like an eternity, he finally moved, slowly, deliberately, towards the counter. My instinct screamed at me to stay calm, but every muscle in my body was tense, ready to bolt if I needed to. He stopped a few feet from the counter, close enough for me to see the dirt caked under his nails and the sweat stains on his shirt. He leaned in slightly, his voice low and gravelly when he finally spoke. "You're alone here, ain't you?" My blood ran cold. I forced myself to stay calm, to not show any fear. "No," I lied, hoping it would deter him. "My coworker's in the back." He smirked, like he knew I was lying. Then he reached into his pocket, and for a split second, I thought he was going to pull out a weapon. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. But instead, He pulled out a crumpled $20 bill and tossed it on the counter. Gas. Pump 3, he muttered. Relieved, I quickly rang him up and handed him his receipt, careful not to meet his eyes. He lingered for a moment, staring at me with that same unsettling intensity, before finally turning and walking out of the store. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My hands were shaking as I watched him through the window. He filled up his tank, then stood by his car for a moment, looking back at the store. For a terrifying moment, I thought he was going to come back in. But then he got in his car and drove off, disappearing into the night. I thought that was the end of it, but when my shift ended at 6 a.m., I walked out to my car and froze. Sitting on my windshield, held down by the wiper blade, was the same crumpled $20 bill. I looked around, but the parking lot was empty. There was no sign of the man. I never saw him again, but for weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I worked a night shift, I'd find excuses to stay behind the counter, my eyes constantly scanning the parking lot, waiting for that man to return. Last story, the Boathouse incident. I grew up in a small town on the edge of a large lake in northern Alabama. Summers there were spent swimming, fishing, and boating with friends, and most weekends, we'd hang out at an old boathouse that had been abandoned for years. The place was run down, with peeling paint and broken windows, but it was our little hideaway. One evening, just as the sun was setting, my friend Travis and I decided to head out to the boathouse to fish off the dock. The water was calm, and the air was thick with the sounds of frogs and crickets. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. As we sat there, casting our lines into the water, we heard a noise behind us. Something heavy, like a thud, coming from inside the boathouse. We both froze, exchanging nervous glances. The boathouse had always creeped us out a little, especially after dark, but we never thought much of it. We figured it was just the old building settling, or maybe an animal that had wandered in. Travis, being the braver of the two of us, decided to check it out. "Stay here," he said, grabbing a flashlight from his tackle box. I wanted to protest, but I didn't want to seem like a coward, so I nodded and stayed put, gripping my fishing pole a little tighter. He disappeared into the shadows of the boathouse, the beam of his flashlight bobbing as he moved. I could hear his footsteps echoing inside, followed by a muffled curse as he tripped over something. Then, there was silence. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, straining to hear anything. Travis's footsteps, his voice, anything. But there was nothing. Just the sound of the water lapping against the dock and the distant call of a loon. After what felt like an eternity, I couldn't take it anymore. I called out to him, but there was no response. Fear clawed at my insides, and every instinct told me to run, but I couldn't leave him in there. I grabbed my own flashlight and ventured into the boathouse. The inside was even darker than I expected, the smell of mildew strong in the air. I swept the flashlight beam across the room, but there was no sign of Travis. Just old, rotting wooden crates and piles of debris. "Travis?" I called out, my voice shaking. Silence. Then, in the corner of the room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, half hidden behind a stack of crates, was Travis's flashlight, still on but lying on the ground. But Travis was nowhere to be seen. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I backed away, my breath coming in shallow gasps, when I heard it, a faint, wet dragging sound coming from the shadows deeper in the boathouse. I turned and ran, bursting out of the boathouse and not stopping until I was halfway back to town. I didn't stop to look back. I just ran, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't go back to the boathouse that night, and when I finally had the courage to return the next day with a group of friends, Travis was there, sitting on the dock, confused but unharmed. He had no memory of what happened after he entered the boathouse, and he couldn't explain how he ended up outside. We never figured out what happened that night, and we avoided the boathouse after that. Something was in there, something that wanted us gone. And whatever it was, I'm certain it was responsible for what happened to Travis, even if we never saw it again. And there you have it, 8 stories from the heart of the Deep South that remind us of just how close we can come to the edge of something truly terrifying. Each of these encounters is a stark reminder that real fear doesn't always stem from the supernatural. Sometimes, the most unsettling experiences are grounded in reality, making them that much harder to shake off when the lights go out. Call to action, CTA. If these stories have left you with a chill running down your spine, share them with someone else who loves a good scare. And remember, next time you find yourself in the dark corners of the South, keep your eyes and ears open. You never know what might be lurking just beyond the shadows.